The conference room on the 14th floor of that building in Columbus was so quiet I could hear the ventilation humming through the ceiling. Raymond sat across from me with his attorney beside him, a younger man in a gray suit who kept straightening his tie. My own attorney sat to my left, his hand flat on the table, not moving. The documents were already spread out in front of us. 31 years of my life, stacked in 2-inch piles, waiting for my signature. Raymond looked at me the way he used to look at me when we were boys, and he wanted the last piece of pie. Not asking, just assuming. I picked up the pen. My attorney leaned close and said, quietly, that I didn't have to do this, that we had options, that he'd spent 3 weeks building a case and he believed we would win. I told him I understood. I thanked him, and then I signed every page. Raymond smiled. His attorney collected the papers without reading through them a second time. Diane, Raymond's wife, was waiting in the lobby downstairs. I knew because I'd seen her car in the parking structure when I pulled in that morning. She would be the first person he called. They would probably go to dinner that night, somewhere nice, somewhere they felt they deserved. I drove home alone. The house was quiet the way it had been quiet for 4 years, since my wife passed. I sat in the kitchen and I made a pot of coffee I didn't drink. And then I called my son. My father started the business in 1971 out of a rented garage in Zanesville. He made custom metal brackets and fixture hardware, mostly for commercial contractors, mostly on handshake agreements with men he'd known since high school. He was not a complicated man. He believed that if you did good work and treated people fairly, the rest took care of itself. He died believing that. I am not sure he was wrong. When Raymond and I took over the business in 1991, my father sat us down at the same kitchen table where I am sitting now, and he said 2 things. He said, take care of each other. And he said, don't let money make you into somebody you don't recognize. Then he shook our hands like we were business partners, not his sons, and he went to watch the evening news. We signed the partnership agreement that same month. My attorney at the time, a man named Gerald, who has since retired to Florida, drew it up. It was 14 pages. Raymond and I both read it. I still have the original in the fireproof safe in my study, the same safe my father used to keep in his garage. The combination is my mother's birthday. For 20 years, we did well. Not spectacular, but well. We expanded twice, moved to a proper facility outside of Newark, hired 16 full-time employees. Raymond handled sales and client relationships. I handled operations, procurement, the production floor. We didn't socialize much outside of work. Our lives had moved in different directions after our 20s, but we were brothers and we ran a good business, and I thought that was enough. The first sign was small. It usually is. My son noticed it before I did. He was visiting for Thanksgiving, his 3rd year out of college, working in Cincinnati at the time. He asked me why Derek Raymond's son-in-law, who had been working in our shipping department for about 8 months, was listed as operations coordinator on the company website. I told him it must be a title Raymond gave him informally. My son asked me if I knew about it before it was posted. I said I was sure it was just an oversight, a miscommunication. My son looked at me the way young people look at older people when they don't want to say what they're actually thinking. He went back to his turkey and didn't push it. But I thought about that conversation for a long time afterward. The next 18 months were an education in how a person can be removed from something they built without being told it's happening. Derek started attending the production meetings I normally ran. At first, he just sat in the back and took notes. Then Raymond started asking his opinion. Then one Tuesday morning I arrived, and Derek was already standing at the whiteboard, marker in hand, going through the weekly numbers. He nodded at me when I walked in like I was a visitor. I didn't say anything that day. I told myself it was a transition, that Raymond was thinking about the future of the business, about bringing in younger leadership. I told myself that was reasonable. Equipment started showing up that I hadn't approved. New lease agreements with vendors I'd never spoken to. An invoice from an IT company in Columbus for what was described as a systems audit. I found that one on my desk by accident. Someone had printed it and left it in the wrong folder. When I brought it to Raymond, he said he'd been meaning to talk to me about modernizing our infrastructure. He said it with the tone of someone who had already decided the conversation's outcome. I asked him when we had discussed authorizing outside contractors without mutual sign-off, which was a requirement under our original agreement. He said that clause was outdated, that we needed to be more agile. That was the word he used. Agile. Raymond had never used that word in 30 years. I went home that night and I opened the fireproof safe. I took out the partnership agreement and I read it from the first page to the last. Then I called Gerald in Florida. He was 73 years old and mostly retired, but he still answered his phone. We talked for an hour. After that conversation, I didn't sleep, but not because I was afraid. I didn't sleep because I was thinking very carefully about what I needed to do, and thinking carefully has never come easy to me in the dark. I want to be honest about something. There was a period of several months where I convinced myself I was misreading the situation. That Raymond was under pressure I didn't understand. That Derek was ambitious but not malicious. That families go through difficult seasons and find their way back. I want to be honest because if you've been in a version of this, if someone you trusted started quietly moving the furniture of your life while you were looking the other way, you probably already know how easy it is to explain things away. We do it because the alternative is grief. And grief for a living person, for a relationship you thought you understood, is a particular kind of hard. The armchair in my father's office, at the original facility, the one he sat in every Friday afternoon when he reviewed the week's numbers, had been moved to a storage room sometime in December. I noticed it in January when I was looking for a box of archived invoices from 2003. It was pushed against the back wall behind some shelving units. I stood there looking at it for a while. I didn't move it back, but I took a photograph. I don't know entirely why. I suppose I was starting to document things without fully admitting to myself that I was documenting things. The conversation where Raymond told me he wanted to buy me out happened on a Thursday afternoon in April. He came to my office, which he almost never did. Normally I went to his and he closed the door, which he never did. He sat down and he said he'd been thinking about the company's future. He said he believed the business needed unified leadership to grow into the next decade. He said he had spoken to a financial advisor and that the offer he was prepared to make was fair. He slid a folder across my desk. I opened it. I looked at the number at the bottom of the proposal page. I asked him if he was serious. He said he thought it was generous given the current market conditions. The number he offered was less than a third of what my share of the business was worth by any reasonable valuation. It did not account for my ownership stake in the facility building, which we held jointly. It did not account for the customer contracts I had personally negotiated and maintained for over 2 decades. It did not account for a particular licensing arrangement that had been quietly generating revenue for 11 years, and that Raymond, I now understood, believed he could simply absorb once I was out. I closed the folder. I told him I'd think about it. He looked surprised. I think he expected me to argue. I called Gerald again that evening. Then I called a business litigation attorney in Columbus that Gerald recommended. Then I called my son. He answered on the second ring and I told him everything, start to finish, the way I hadn't let myself tell anyone in over a year. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment and then he said, "Dad, tell me what you need me to do." That was the moment I stopped grieving and started planning. My attorney in Columbus, who I will call my attorney because that is what matters, spent 6 weeks reviewing the original 1,991 partnership agreement, alongside every amendment, addendum, and supplemental agreement that had been executed in the years since. He was methodical and unhurried, and he had the kind of eyes that missed very little. What he found was this. In 1998, when Raymond and I had expanded the business and brought on our first major commercial client, we had executed a supplemental agreement to govern intellectual property developed in connection with our production processes. This was Gerald's work. It was technically precise, and more importantly, it was specific. Any proprietary process, method, or licensing arrangement developed primarily through the operational division, which was my domain, was attributed to me personally as the originating partner. The business held a use license. The underlying ownership was mine. The licensing arrangement Raymond had been planning to absorb after my buyout, it was not his to take. The arrangement had been running for 11 years because a contractor we worked with in Indiana had adapted one of our fabrication methods for a different industry and had been paying a modest quarterly licensing fee. It was not a dramatic sum, but it was mine. And more than that, the underlying process which the Indiana contractor had sublicensed to 2 other companies was mine. Raymond's attorney, in preparing the buyout documents, had reviewed our most recent operating agreement and the standard partnership filings. He had not reviewed the 1,998 supplemental agreement. Raymond When I asked him directly in a later conversation whether he had given his attorney all of the foundational documents, told me he had given him what was relevant. I did not correct him. I said I'd been thinking about his offer. I said I was willing to consider a negotiated exit. I said I didn't want this to become a legal battle between brothers. He relaxed visibly. Diane called me that weekend, which she hadn't done in over a year, to say she thought we were handling things maturely. My attorney advised me to push back on the valuation, to counter at a number closer to fair market and negotiate from there. He said we had a strong position and he thought we could do significantly better than Raymond's initial offer. I told him I wanted to accept. He leaned back in his chair and looked at me for a long moment. I told him there were a few conditions I needed written into the final agreement. Small things, I said. Housekeeping. I handed him a one-page list. He read it. He looked up. He said, "You understand what this does." I said I did. I told him to draft it cleanly and to make sure every clause was properly cross-referenced to the 1991 agreement and the 1998 supplemental, not buried. In plain language, properly cited, in the body of the document where any competent attorney would see it, he said. And if his attorney reads it carefully? I said that was Raymond's attorney's job, not mine. He drafted it. It was clean and thorough and completely transparent if you read it. I reviewed it 4 times. I made one minor change to the language in Section 3. And then I was ready. Raymond's attorney was a younger man, as I mentioned. He had a good suit and a quick way of talking that suggested he was used to deals moving at his preferred pace. When my attorney submitted the final agreement, Raymond's attorney requested 2 days to review. That was a Thursday. By Friday afternoon, he had sent back a clean approval. My attorney called me when he got the confirmation. He was quiet for a moment before he said it. He said, "Martin, he signed off on everything." I thanked him. I asked him to confirm the closing date. The conference room on the 14th floor, the quiet ventilation, the pen in my hand. I signed. For 3 weeks after the closing, I did very little. My son drove up from Cincinnati and stayed with me for a long weekend. We fixed a section of fence in the backyard that had been leaning since the previous winter. We cooked dinner together both nights. Nothing complicated. The kind of cooking my wife used to call honest food. He asked me twice if I was okay, and both times I told him I was better than I'd been in a long time. He looked at me the way he'd looked at me at Thanksgiving 3 years earlier, trying to read past what I was saying. But this time, what I was saying was true. On a Tuesday morning, about 3 weeks after closing, my phone rang. It was my attorney. He said Raymond's attorney had been in contact. He said there seemed to be some confusion about the terms of the licensing arrangement and about the IP ownership provisions in the agreement. I asked what kind of confusion. He said Raymond's attorney was claiming the 1998 supplemental agreement had not been sufficiently disclosed prior to closing. I asked my attorney where in the closing documents the 1998 supplemental was referenced. He said, Section 4, Paragraph 2, with full citation. I asked if Raymond's attorney had approved the documents in writing. He said yes. I said, then I'm not sure what the confusion is. What followed over the next several weeks, I will not recount in full, because it is not the part of this story that matters most. What matters is this. The licensing arrangement remained mine. The sublicensing revenue remained mine. The underlying process documentation, which I had retained in physical and digital copies in the fireproof safe and in a secure off-site location, remained mine. Raymond received what the closing documents said he received, which was the operating business, the client relationships, the facility lease, and a set of processes he was now required to license from me at the standard rate. His attorney made several attempts to renegotiate. My attorney responded to each one professionally and without hostility. The answer was the same each time. I am told I did not hear this directly, that there was a significant argument at Raymond's house the evening his attorney explained the situation to him fully. I am told that Diane had already begun telling people that they had bought out their difficult partner and that the company was now fully in the family. I don't know what she said after that conversation. I didn't need to know. Derek left the company within 4 months. The production floor, without the processes he'd assumed would transfer cleanly, required rebuilding from a foundation that Raymond no longer fully understood. 2 of the long-term employees called me privately to ask if I had anything in the works. I told them honestly that I was considering options. I told them I would let them know. My son came back up in October. He had been talking to a former colleague about starting a smaller, more specialized operation, precision components for the medical device industry, a niche neither Raymond nor I had ever pursued. He sat across from me at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and a cup of coffee, and he laid out the outline of what he was thinking. I listened to the whole thing before I said anything. Then I told him about a conversation I'd had in 1991 at this same table with his grandfather, about the handshake, about what his grandfather had said. My son asked what my father had told us. I said he told us not to let money make us into somebody we didn't recognize. My son was quiet for a moment. Then he asked if I thought Grandpa had known, even back then, that it was advice one of the brothers would eventually need more than the other. I said I thought my father was smarter than people usually gave him credit for. We shook hands across the table. Not as a father and a son, exactly. As partners. Raymond and I have not spoken since the closing, except through attorneys and one brief phone call in November that lasted about 4 minutes and ended when he said something I won't repeat, and I told him I hoped things settled down for him, and I hung up. I don't know if we will speak again in any meaningful way. I have stopped trying to decide how I feel about that. Some things you grieve and then you set down and you walk away from, not because the grief is finished, but because carrying it isn't doing anything useful anymore. My father's armchair is in my study now. I went back to the storage room at the old facility before the transfer was complete, and I asked the facilities manager if I could take it. He said, of course, and helped me carry it to my truck. It sits beside the window that looks out toward the backyard and the fixed fence. I sit in it sometimes in the evenings when the light is low. It still smells faintly of the machine oil my father used to track in from the shop floor, even after all these years. Smells last longer than most things, I've found. Longer than business agreements. Longer, sometimes, than trust. The new business filed its articles of organization on a Wednesday morning in January. My son drove up the night before, and we went through the paperwork together at the kitchen table, the same way my father and Raymond and I had sat at that table 33 years ago. The attorney we used was not Gerald, who is fully retired now, though I called him afterward, and he was pleased. The new attorney is a woman about my son's age who works out of a small firm in Columbus and who asks very precise questions and reads every document twice before she signs off on anything. I decided I liked that about her on our first phone call. The name of the new business was my son's idea. He wanted to use something that referenced the family, the history, the roots of it. I told him I appreciated the thought, but that I wanted something that looked forward instead of backward. He thought about it for a day and came back with something simple and clean, just 2 words. That I agreed with immediately. The morning we filed, the 2 of us went to breakfast at a diner about 3 miles from my house that I've been going to since my wife and I moved here in 1989. The same woman still works the counter on weekday mornings, has for at least 20 years. She brought us coffee without being asked and said it was good to see me with family. My son asked me, over eggs and toast, if I had any regrets. I thought about it honestly. About the years of not saying what I should have said. About the armchair in the storage room, about the photograph on my phone of that armchair in the storage room, which I still haven't deleted, about the 4 minutes on the phone in November and the way Raymond's voice sounded at the end of it, not triumphant the way I might have expected, just tired. People who win the wrong things always sound tired, eventually. I told my son no, not the way he meant. What I gave up knowing what I was keeping. You can't grieve the things you chose to let go of. He nodded like he was filing that away somewhere. I drank my coffee. The morning light came through the diner windows at the angle it only gets in January, low and flat and very clear. Outside on the street, a woman was walking a dog and talking on her phone. An ordinary Tuesday, the first day of whatever came next. I paid for breakfast. We left a good tip. We drove back to my house, and we got to work. I've told this story once before, to a friend of mine who asked how things had turned out with Raymond and the business. He listened all the way through, and then he said he was surprised I didn't seem angrier about it. He said if his brother had done what Raymond did, he'd still be furious. I told him I had been furious. For a long time. Furious in the middle of the night. Furious in the car driving to the office. Furious in that conference room watching Raymond arrange his papers with the satisfied look of a man who believed he was about to win something. But fury is only useful for a while. After that, it just takes up space. What I am now is clear. Clear about what matters, clear about who I am, clear about what I'm building and why. My wife would have seen all of this coming before I did. She had that gift, the ability to see around corners, to sense the shape of things before they arrived. I think about her often when I'm sitting in my father's armchair in the evenings. I think she would have approved of how this ended. Not the fight, not the legal mechanics of it. The part where my son and I shook hands across the kitchen table. That part. She always said the only thing worth fighting for was what you'd still want after the fight was over. She was right. She almost always was. If you're watching this and you're in the middle of something similar, a brother, a partner, someone you built something with who is slowly trying to take it from you, I'm not going to tell you what to do. Every situation is its own shape. But I will tell you what I wish someone had told me earlier. Document everything. Read every piece of paper twice. And be very careful about assuming people you trust have actually read what you've given them. And hold on to the things that matter. Not the things that are worth money, though some of those matter too. The things that are worth something else. The things that, when you sit with them quietly in January light, still feel like yours. That's the part nobody can take in a conference room on the 14th floor. That part you keep.